Welcome to the Time to Talk podcast. It is time to talk the debate. The first presidential race 2024 debate was held last night on ABC, moderated by David Muir and Lindsey Davis, starring Donald J. Trump and Kamala Harris. Now, before we get into the debate analysis and my take on who won, who didn't win, what I thought about the whole thing, I want to first say before we start, many of you, I'm noticing, the hostility continues no matter what. And it's just the environment that we're in. And I did on my very first podcast on this channel, I kind of addressed it. I talked about the idea that everyone is so polarized and so engaged in support for their candidate, for their party. And there seems to be a constant sort of knife wielding demeanor from everybody, especially online, right? Where people get the most, they find the most courage online. And I'm noticing that almost every single post that might in some way disagree with or not align with a particular person's interest or their candidate or whatever the policy issue might be, which hardly ever comes up. It's usually not policy. It's usually some random thing. That people are quick to take the knives out and the guns and start shooting. Even the replies and the comments cannot be civil. Now, I know from my own engagement on social media and some of the postings that I put up prior to expressing myself via this podcast, that I have had my moments where I would put baiting types of post up where I knew that perhaps I was being mildly offensive or I was specifically stirring the pot. So in those particular cases, I understand possibly where these types of comments came from. But I looked at a few things just this morning. I was brushing up and seeing what other people thought about the debate, and I was exploring, online sources and stuff. And just I had answered a question about something, about questions being answered by the candidates and whether or not they answered the questions directly, or if they were very vague, or if they totally just evaded the question entirely. I answered a question about that, and I gather the person who replied to me, somewhat grammatically just all over the place, replied to me with it's black people like you, blah, 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 and they threatened all this stuff. And so, not to belabor the point or continue, but I think it's important messaging going forward in this podcast, considering it's pretty new, that I really think we need to chill out with this idea that we need to attack everybody in our reply or our answer. Let's just be more mindful of how we are actually going to reply or ask questions, have polite discussions with one another and talk. We do not have to assume that because this person likes that person, that must mean you're no good, or we got to chill out with that, right? You guys are concerned with supporting your candidate and you're concerned with supporting your party. And quite frankly, again, if I haven't made my position clear here, I'm way more concerned with what's going on with our country, the fact that we are currently engaged in funding and supporting two wars and on the brink of another war in the Middle East, and all-out chaos, World War III, and the possible threat of nuclear Armageddon being on the rise. We are at a particular place in history where so many things are working together and conspiring together to put us in a really sort of precarious position as a human civilization. AI is on the rise, and the implications of AI and how that works, and how that also is advantageous to the actual intent of the globalist and the technocrats, and what's happening with censorship around the world. We've seen the arrest in France and in Brazil, and these different things taking place regarding censorship and trying to police information and independent media sources, and to police and to shut down and suppress any type of dissent or any type of language that goes against the establishment and their particular narrative and what they want you to know. And that is all usually under the guise of protection, or hey, we have to stop hate speech, or hey, it's all for the interest of the world. That's why we have to take away your freedoms. And that's usually the way it starts. That's how authoritarian governments, dictatorships, take your pick. That's usually the way they start, by censoring speech and censoring and removing your ability, a nation's ability, a citizen's ability to question their government. This is founding principles of our democracy, of our government, of our Constitution. And when that starts to become negotiable and starts to be eroded through powers that be, you need to question that. So I'm much more concerned with those things on a whole than I am with whether Kamala Harris or Trump is going to do XYZ when it comes to take your pick of populist topics or whatever it's going to be, how they feel about abortion. I'm not suggesting I don't have a opinion on their particular take on these policies, but at this particular point, I'm much more invested in other things. So with that out of the way, let's get into what I thought about the debate. I'm going to say this. I'll start by saying that I think Kamala Harris won the debate. I think it's clear. I think she proved in that moment that she came out like a politician, and it worked to her advantage, whereas Trump folded and Trump allowed the part of him that we all know, which is just this, verbal diarrhea, to flow from him. And he was inconsistent and incoherent at certain points and just seriously like all over the place and doing his normal off the cuff. I'm not going to practice a debate. I'm not going to do a mock debate. I'm just going to go out there and say whatever comes to mind. And who cares what my staff and people say behind me? And that was evident. And Kamala came out prepared. She came out like a district attorney. She came out like a politician who's been established in that DC esque environment for quite some time and has been grown in that environment. And that's how she came out. Now, that's not me saying that I agree with everything or think that she was any more credible or less credible than Trump, right? They both lied and they both had their moments of just totally lying on one another or evading answers and being vague about their own positions on things. But I do think she won overall. And I think as a politician, as a person running for the office of president, she demonstrated that it goes beyond her normal word salad nonsense and sounding like she's, half drunk. And I think she earned some points with me in regard to how she handled herself last night. And I do think she whooped Trump. I think Trump was, again, just all over the place and allowing himself to be off message and to not really attack her in the places where he had the ammunition, he had the bullets to attack her. He didn't attack her. Now, with all of that said, I also want to make mention of the fact that I don't think that the debate was entirely fair. In fact, it's very clear. And if you sort of on your own just go to a lot of the different sources this morning and look at the reaction, on multiple media sources, that it was highly biased and highly favored for Harris. And David Muir did a terrible job as a moderator by essentially attacking and fact-checking Trump through what's supposed to be a presidential debate where there should be an objective moderator, and their position is not to sit there and question or attack or really fact-check each candidate in the moment, which is what it seemed. That's what happened last night. They didn't do the same thing to Kamala Harris. Now, obviously, without having to, again, don't want this to be emotional for people who think it's, Kamala Harris, you're attacking. Obviously, the institution, the legacy media, the corporations that be, ABC News, is in the pocket. It's Democrats, the corporatist, Wall Street, and they're going to favor the Kamala Harris campaign. And that's just the way it is. That's a fact. So it's not surprising that it went that way, but I just want to point out that it was quite obvious too. I don't even think they tried to mask it. It was just very blatant that Muir had made attacks and he made it his point to argue with Trump and to push Trump on certain issues, which I think to a certain degree makes sense that you push the candidates. It's just a little unfair and it's clearly biased when you do not do the same thing to the other side. The very opening question for Harris was whether or not you believe that the American economy and the American people are better off today than they were 4 years ago. And she went into some other totally different thing about where she's from and what her vision was, and she did not answer the question. Now, that's a moment where Mir or Lindsey Davis could have taken the time to say, Vice President, could you answer the question, though? Do you feel America is better off? And they didn't do that to her. Now, Trump, they went several times in on him on several different things. And that just wasn't fair. So I will say all that. As far as the lies and as far as a typical politician, during a debate thing and who says what. And yeah, you know what? We could spend all day fact checking back and forth. There was a lot of things. Harris did the typical thing of painting him as a criminal, which he is a criminal, right? Like he's done some bad things. There's no question about it, right? I'm not sitting here defending Donald Trump. But she did lie about certain things that have been fact-checked and have been debunked for a long time now. But she used them as talking points, and it made sense. Even she knows that they aren't true, but it's in the moment with the American people watching. Your goal is to paint this other person a certain way and to go with narrative that paints him in a terrible light, like the fact that he said there were good people on both sides of some Nazi riot or anti-Semitic people in this crowd, which that was debunked, and he did not say that. The full statement, he clearly points out that he's not talking about, and he's condemning the anti-Semites, and he's condemning these Nazi people, whatever. And he made it very clear in that full statement. But if you listen to it out of context and you take it from what's spinning viral in a viral fashion from the Democrats and anyone who's anti-Trump, it's going to sound really bad, as it did to me when I first heard it, but not the case. It's been debunked. Certain things about like IVF, the fertilization, Trump has always supported that and always been that. She totally lied on that one. He lied on a bunch of stuff regarding the economy and jobs, and it's not as, I think what's hard to do for the American public, for the average viewer watching this, is analyzing and becoming a financial economist or somebody who's well-versed in inflation and numbers and the Federal Reserve and understanding domestic versus foreign GDP and all these different things and the impact of COVID and what that had and recessions and depressions and dates and times and what quarter versus that quarter and how many jobs, how many immigration jobs, how many legal immigrants actually gain jobs versus domestic workers, and how does it affect the unemployment numbers. I think all of that is hard to digest in the moment for the average viewer. So in a debate stage format where you have two people that are going back and forth and one is saying, well, we had more jobs than this one. It might be true, but only from a certain perspective. And maybe it's not entirely true. Trump lied about a lot of that stuff. Did she lie about certain things and have inaccuracies when it came to inflation? Yeah, she did. They both did. So without going into an entire thing of fact checking every detail here on this show, because that's not what we do, I just want to point out to you that it is difficult to assess who exactly is, certain things are obvious. You can kind of tell who, it's a little, we all know that was bullshit, but sometimes you can't. So I think with the economy and with jobs and things like that, I think Trump certainly played his hand a certain way, and she did the same thing, and it is what it is. But one of the moments that I was waiting for was dealing with any of the situation with our current wars, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, where we are, because this is what really concerns me and should concern the American public. And I believe overwhelmingly from polls that a majority of Americans are actually concerned with this. This has a direct impact on our debt, on inflation, on our economy, domestic policy, and what's happening with us, our position in the world. And again, like I said, the human race in general, the welfare of the human race and the future of the human race for generations to come. So when they brought up Ukraine and the Russia and Israel, Hamas, right? It was interesting to watch that it was scripted. I literally mouthed it prior to her saying it with my wife. I said, here it comes. She's going to say the following. And sure enough, she did the speaking line of, let it be clear, stand with Israel. Let it be clear, stand with Israel. Let it be clear, defend Israel. It wasn't a down the middle sort of like, look, we've got to figure this out. We've got to get things, even if you're 100% in the pocket for AIPAC and the Netanyahu, which they are clearly, like there's a way of describing that a little bit different and being a little more sensitive to the many Americans, again, an overwhelming majority of Americans who feel that what's happening currently in Israel is considered genocide. And there are things that are happening that need to be, that historically, we're going to look back at some certain point in time and we're going to really regret what's going on. And I'm not sure how they're going to clean this up, but it would have been nice just to have an answer that suggested, hey, yeah, we stand with Israel. We stand with these people. Anyone to defend people and to protect civil rights and to protect certain things. And it's a complicated situation, but we're trying to work through it. That would have been a much better answer. Instead, she did the typical, hey, we're in the pocket for Israel. And then what he did was even worse, because he went in and did, instead of sort of doing his own thing, he did like I said, a fifth grade, on a playground fight. Like, well, I'm more pro-Israel than you are. I was baffled. They kind of argued about who was more pro-Israel to get those points. Yay. That was kind of pathetic. It really was. I think a lot of the things that the average American is looking at in terms of policy, and again, for things that will affect your bottom line, affect your pocket, I don't think those things were clearly spelled out. Certainly not by her, and definitely not by him. Him bringing up cats, eating the cats and dogs was ridiculous. He really, even if he put it in for 2 seconds and it was just his typical humor, like, it would have been fine, but he kept it going, and he could have nailed her on so many other things and really, really taken her to task on things had he been somewhat prepared. And he was not. And she was. And again, to reiterate, I think she took that round. I'm not sure they're going to have another debate. I doubt it. If they do, I wonder if it will be on Fox News and something a little more favorable to Trump. We will see. I don't know. Really not much more else to say. Again, I think it was heavily favored towards Harris, and I think that was unfair from a moderation standpoint for a debate. They're just another example of her changing of policy positions when it comes to fracking, to the gun buyback program, and certain things along those lines, that she just totally, instead of them pushing her and saying, yes, this was you in 2019, and you've changed your views since then. Like, they didn't really go there with her, and they should have. So I think it was an unfair debate. I do think she won, and we'll see what happens next. Again, if anything I say to you, my message is more about, I'm concerned more with my Black, brown, white, Latino, Jewish, Catholic, Christian, agnostic, atheist, Muslim, whatever, LGBTQ, XYZ people getting along and working to not necessarily eviscerate one another every single time something comes up that sort of mildly disaligns with our own thoughts on a candidate, right? These are people. At the end of the day, what I really want you to understand is there's a much larger force working behind the scenes to actually orchestrate all this. So whoever gets in office, please do not think that Kamala Harris is going to get in office and she's going to suddenly work for the poor man, for the middle class, and for small businesses, when all she's done is work for large corporations her entire time as a politician. This is who she is beholden to. This is who she has and whose pocket she resides in. Trump, the only thing about Trump, he's anti-establishment. He came from out of politics. He got in. They couldn't stand this guy from the beginning. And somehow he managed to get into office. And he disturbs the very nature of the illusion of democracy that we have, where you normally have this plutocracy. You've got a Democrat, a Republican. They do the best job they can to squeeze out any type of independent or anyone who goes against establishment, who might have a populist sense of views and policies, right? They squish that person out, and then we all agree to take this candidate and that candidate. And then they go for it. They're usually both sort of decent. They're both from Washington. They fight it out, and then we have who we have. And at the end of the day, everything remains the same. Sure, there are some differences in their policies on abortion. And if they have an opportunity to elect a Supreme Court judge, depending on which party it is, obviously they're going to pick people and elect people based on their favorable views, whether it's conservative or liberal, right? Which is what happened with Trump when he put 3 Supreme Court justices in, right? I mean, no matter who was there, if it was a Republican and they had the opportunity to put in Supreme Court justice, they were going to put in conservative Supreme Court justice. It wasn't just Trump on his own decided to do that. So again, I say all this to let you know that you should be looking at the larger picture. You should be looking at what's happening behind the scenes with censorship. Look what's happening with the Democrats and the way that party is operating, and whether the Trump administration is going to continue. If Trump gets in office, the Republicans are doing the same thing. Don't be fooled by the thought, or I should say, don't think that I'm telling you that Trump will be any different. I'm explaining to you that him getting in office or her getting in office, there's the powers that be behind this that are much more concerning. Big corporations, the pharmaceutical industry, the military-industrial complex. You should be paying attention to those entities and looking at Wall Street executives who are going to be appointed, who are already appointed to handle our fiscal policies and regulations. The regulatory bodies are all staffed with people who have their own interest at hand. Big banks. Study a little bit of history, get a little more involved in what it is that's happening behind the scenes as opposed to being beguiled by the things in front of you. That's my message for today. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on the debate in the comments below. Again, we're working to get the podcast up on all major streaming platforms for podcasts. If you've not subscribed here, hit that subscribe button so we can grow the channel and I can continue to make this content for you and continue to bring some sort of objective reasoning and some sort of something to the table and have some polite discourse along the way. I will be bringing guests on at some point. I'll be looking to have people on and have these discussions with me, and I look forward to that. In the meantime, I will see you on the next That Guy Talks. That's my other channel. In the meantime, I will see you on the next Time to Talk podcast. Enjoy. I'll talk to you soon. Peace.